And it's interesting, the backstory here, because when I first came to the University of Saskatchewan in 2000, a civil and geological engineering professor in the back corner who's got a beard just like mine, called me up and said he'd like to go to lunch. And this was very strange, and I felt very nervous. But he brought me to lunch and asked me what I did. And he said, well, I can do all that, but can you do this? And I said, I think I can do that. He goes, well, that's what you're doing on our new research project. And brought me up to, provided me a great lifelong opportunity, brought me up to Key Lake, Saskatchewan to work on a uranium mine there. And so I've had this sort of secret side career that's looked at sort of mining impacts in Canada. And I'm really not going to let data get in the way of a good story here. So don't worry too much about the details. I'm just going to talk a bit about how the resource economy sector in Canada influences the future hydrology or present hydrology of Canada, and how we're sort of all in this together. Canada, pretty much like Australia and South Africa, is one of these countries which is still a primary resource-driven economy. We like to cut trees, we like to dig holes, and we like to sell it to people. We get all worked up when there's tariffs and softwood lumber, et cetera, but it's a peculiar economy of earth exploitation, and as we do this, it involves a fair amount of disturbance to the hydrological cycle. So there's Canadian hydrologists all over who've been looking at sort of these areas of the country that are major resource extraction sector, whether it be oil, gas, you sort of name it, we'll dig it out of the ground and sell it to people, and then deal with the legacy of what happens afterwards. So there's no doubt that Canada's reliant on it. Here's our dollar versus the price of oil. So we have a real stake in sort of global crises and these sort of things, because it has a strong impact on our economy, which basically goes lockstep with sort of actually integrated measures of resource. That's the only real thing that controls the fluctuation in our dollar. And even the great among us are interested in this now. Jeff has moved here to, gotcha. It's not you this time, John. Jeff moved here to Saskatchewan and is in on the take and opened the new mine overlay site testing facility. And every time I show the slide, he's got to give me $1. So that's good. So there's a number of things that's interesting, and I want to take you to two places. Working with Lee Barber and Jim Hendry to start this kind of stuff, these are the sort of the questions that drove the work that we were doing, is how can we improve essentially environmental stewardship with respect to water, and how can we help operators essentially reduce their costs and liabilities through improved scientific understanding. The mining industry is very, very sophisticated. There's lots of great engineers and scientists who work through consultings and in their companies, but quite often they have a very different view of the data and how they collect data. So it was worthwhile to sort of get Canadian scientists in, and a lot of us, Bing sees here, and me, Nelsher Baggy, worked on this for a while and smartly walked away, and sort of these sort of things that help them with their data understand their system. So I'm going to go two places, to the right, to the left. We're going to go to southern British Columbia, not too far from where John used to hang out, and I'm going to take you to the oil sands of Alberta. Surface mining is the fastest growing type of mining in the world. What does that mean? It means just digging down to the ore body, or in the case of British Columbia, repurposing a mountain by blowing it up and throwing it in the valley beside it. This has been going on in the Elk Valley for over 100 years, resulting in selenium water quality levels that exceed the guidelines, the federal guidelines, provincial guidelines in the wastewater. Sorry, not the wastewater, in the actual major rivers that are often transboundary. So this is a major issue of concern. The U.S. state of Montana has sued, has initiated a lawsuit. There's all sorts of crazy things that are going on. It's making sort of international news. So I guess the issue was that they called up Lee, a person we used to work with in the oil sands, and essentially to look at how we can really sort of understand mine practice to look at how sources of water and chemicals and what their legacy effects is. And is there any way within a mining context to really manage watersheds, place watersheds, have them a certain geometry to really reduce the loading of these sort of constituents of concern, whether it be nitrate, whether it be selenium, into the water. And these are pretty challenging environments to work in, but it's interesting how these companies, when you actually go there and open up the books, they collect mountains of data for compliance. And so they're always reporting this data to the government year after year after year, and no one ever looks at it. No one ever looks at it. They just report it, and all they're ever looking at is to see if they've exceeded the guideline. No one actually ever mines the data to see if there's any information in there to help them in their practice. So what we did is we got all their data, or we begged for it. It's actually all publicly available. We got all their sort of mine information. We got all their mine site data and their GIS layers, and we just basically started groping around for relationships. So what does all their data tell us? And so what we do is we look at all these watersheds with spoils and waste rock in different positions. We look at all the major geochemistry and how it changes over the year. And what we want to tell the mine, because this would be something, can you design your mine. Can you put spoils here? Can you put spoils there? They spend a lot of money diverting water around spoils because they think water moving through the spoils mobilizes chemicals. So we went through all their data, we classify it, we sort of grope around for relationships, and then we try to inform the operator to say, hey, this is what's going on with your data that you've never looked at this way. And in the Elk Valley, we basically told them that the only thing that really is reducing the loading of selenium to the river is actually if they initiate reclamation. In British Columbia, everyone thinks British Columbia is green. That's only the lower mainland. British Columbia mining practice is actually much far behind Alberta. They don't cover their spoils. And the only thing that was reducing selenium in the rivers if they actually did cover it and reduce water. So we spent a fair bit of time poking around these things, looking at all the mining, and this is what we go to the mine companies and tell them. We say, well, basically, there's nothing you can do. So keep clean water clean is a waste of money. And this bothers companies because hydrologists go to them, and it bothers consultants because they get tens of millions of dollars to build these things, and we go to the mine company as academics and say, it's a waste of your money. And so who hates us? Both the mine company and the consultants. Basically, it doesn't matter how you build your spoils or where you put them. The only thing you need to do is stop water moving through the spoils. And this was data they had all along. They funded this big research program, but if they would have applied academics to the problem before it started, they could have probably had mitigation measures 10, 20, 30 years ago, because now we have these giant kilometer-size waste rock piles that either need to be covered or Tyvect or something like that. So this is sort of where it's sort of at now. That's one sort of interesting post hoc sort of analysis of mining data. But there's other places that are actually, in some ways, crazier and more interesting to work because we can do actual scientific experimentation. This is Base Mine at Syncrude. Those are elemental sulfur piles where the water comes out of the bottom at pH of -2, I think is about right, so don't put your finger in there. And and this is a good quote from a book, is that we sort of really don't know how to reclaim these ecosystems, but we don't really have time to figure it out. We have to do it anyway, so we're sort of doing it on the fly. And it allows all sorts of interesting sort of opportunity for ecosystem experimentation that as an environmental scientist and a geoscientist, we wouldn't, and as engineers, we wouldn't get to do if it weren't for this opportunity. So we should really use this opportunity in these massive footprint areas. I'll back out to, there's Lake Athabasca, there's Great Slave Lake. I mean, these are very large environmental footprints to sort of, and this is a mining slide, basically start from nothing and rebuild these forests. So as Canadians, we can cut them down and sell our cheap pine to the US with beetles in it, right? So that's sort of what Canadians do. This is probably a better picture of what we want to do. We got to make that. And they come to us and they say, how do you make that? And it involves a fair bit of hydro fantasy. There's a lot of natural sort of research that goes into guiding. This is a picture of this wetland that's doesn't look like a wetland yet, but that's from 2012. There's a lot of work from other folks, Kevin DeVito and Carl Mendoza and Lee, and folks sit around a room and they talk about how to put these things together. But the cool thing about working with the mining industry is that if you have a good relationship, you can do all sorts of crazy things. We have to build a wetland, but we mine wetlands, right? We have to strip away the wetland to get to the ore because it's surface mining. So why don't we just build a wetland extraction device, cut the wetland out in the winter, put it on, lift it out, put it on a skidder, put it on a truck, drive it down the highway, put it in a ditch, unload it, put some peat around it, water it, and there's our wetland, or a wetland experiment, right? So there's a lot of amazing, really expensive, really sort of fundamental split trial science that we can do in sort of working with mining companies because, they're really running blind. So we use a lot of this information to sort of guide us on the Sandhill Fen. Sandhill Fen was one of two constructed mine sites, constructed wetlands in Fort McMurray, the other one's at Suncor. And this is sort of an over-engineered fen. It's got a watering pond, it's got underdrains to keep the salts down. There's a lot of really caustic and sodic material because of the extraction process and soft tailings that has to be managed these landscapes, but we have to put stuff on top. So what do? We sort of design these systems as best we think from natural analogs. We sort of get trucks, and this is just going to be we have this big pit here, and we move things around. Here's a few Google Earth images of just the site. We're sort of making this thing here. Some construction's happened. We can see this little wetland starting. We got some boardwalks going in. It's getting greener and greener, and then we have this. So this is something that, probably cost $50 million to sort of put together from beginning to end to sort of build this thing to prove that indeed in these landscapes, you can see it sitting within quite a disturbed landscape that we can do this. And then what we do is we go to the regulator and say, you know what? We've gone to these ecosystems. We've created wetlands. We measure. This is just net ecosystem exchange. So basically these become carbon sinks after a certain amount of time. And this is the information we use armed with real a priori experimental scientific knowledge that we can pass on to consultants and we can pass on to other researchers. So when they do this, they'll have some methods and learn from the mistakes that we always continuously make. So again, as an environmental scientist and as a Canadian scientist, there's a lot of us engaged in these sort of, I don't know, scoundrelous activities. I think John's the only one who probably has never worked for a mine. Oh no, you worked for a mining company now that I think about it, and it'll come up in a second. The other thing that's interesting is that the water and chemical cycles in these environments are really out of phase. And when we look at mining, and we look at its legacy, and it was brought up this morning, we have legacy, the wheels are very different. We have a fast wheel of hydrology and can grow plants. But over time, and here's just the fen, it's like a pinhole, it gets saltier and saltier and saltier and saltier. Right? So every year we have to watch this hydrological cycle, and we have this geochemical cycle, which actually may be hundreds of years behind. So again, amazing, interesting scientific issues that we can put lots of smart Canadian minds on, because in Canada, we have all sorts of problems. We don't just have mines and pits, we have lakes we have to do, we have all sorts of things we have to do to clean up from the mess we're making, and from the mess that we've made. Canada is the home of more abandoned mines than any other country in the world. This is where John has worked before. This is Faro. And actually, he didn't work there. He just lent a model to work there. It was Rick that worked there. So his hands are clean. And Faro was at one point the world's largest mine. And it was a huge sort of metal mine, and it's abandoned, and the zinc concentrations in the river now are just astronomical. The government has spent $250 million to find nothing and has committed another $250 million to figure out something else. They just this year released this environmental liability for contaminated mine sites in Canada. $9.1 billion is the total liability estimate. We're holding a lot as taxpayers, but notice the central provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba haven't reported their liabilities in abandoned mines. My guess is the uranium mines in Saskatchewan cost a little bit of money to clean up. So as taxpayers, as Canadians, as hydrologists, we're probably real global citizens if we get our students interested in this sort of stuff, although it's maybe not as fun. It's certainly not as fun as working in Wolf Creek and driving skidoos around and drinking scotch because we've got to wear hard hats and steel-toe boots. But it's certainly something I think as a Canadian it's sort of critically important for society, and where I think a lot of people should sort of focus some of their efforts because Justin would want us to do that. So, and again, I think the last person I'd want to thank is Lee Barber, who got me into this a long time ago, and I still think there's a long way to go. I don't know if those of you who are old movie fans, when the Peter Sellers movie there, it's like, yeah, right? So, but this was a quote, I think someone like Jesus said it, but I know Lee says it sometime. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with only a single step. So thanks, Lee, for the wild ride, and thanks, Howard, for the support you've shown us over the last 7 years. And yeah, that's all I got. Thanks. Grant.
Sean, a few years ago you mentioned that in the oil sands they were thinking of changing the depth of the soil over top of the overburden, I think. And did that happen, or are they still sticking with it?
It did, and so Lee and I were involved in this. The government of Alberta wanted 1.5 meters of soil over this sort of saline, or this sort of bad stuff. And then so we spent a lot of time proving that you only needed 80 centimeters or a meter, because actually if you built 1.5 meters of soil, there'd be no wetlands. And they want wetlands, they want lakes, so it'd just be a big sponge. And that small bit of research saved the company $500 million. And strangely enough, the regulator didn't want to do it. And we were in the room with the regulator and the guy from industry, and he looked at Lee and I and said, if you don't listen to a scientific case, these guys are fired. Because why do we support science if you're not going to change the rules based on science? And Lee and I were like, we can hear you. But we kept our jobs, so it was good.